Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of Leaders and Friends. It's my great honor today to share the stage with Rob Siegel. Rob's been a friend of mine for a long time. He's my co-teacher at Stanford. He's one of the most popular lecturers in the school. He's just a passionate, great guy with great insights in terms of both what students are thinking today but also perspective on the business world. He's an author, and we'll go through that today. But it's Rob, it's great to have you here today, and I look forward to sharing a great conversation with you.
Thanks, Jeff. Always great to be here. And I'm actually looking forward to our class starting again soon, so I'll get to see you more often and not just on Zoom.
Yeah, me too. Me too. It's great fun. So Rob, how did you get into the teaching business? You know, you're a Stanford MBA. You spent time at Intel and GE and other great companies. How did you end up back in the classroom?
It was actually more by accident than anything. So when I graduated from Stanford, I went to work for Intel. And as you may recall, in the mid 90s, we had a flaw with our flagship microprocessor, the Pentium. And Andy Grove, who had been one of my teachers, decided to write a book, and he asked me to do his research for the book. And he let me actually follow him and his co-teacher, a gentleman named Professor Robert Burgelman. He let me follow them around just to see what teaching was like. And I kept in touch with the university over the years, and then did some work with Professor Burgelman on, we wrote a few cases together and a couple of papers. And the next thing I knew, I just kept coming to class more and more. And then I was given a dean's appointment. And then over time, my time at Stanford really just grew. I really enjoyed being in the classroom. The young men and women that I get to teach, or we get to teach, they come from all over the world. And so you get to learn a lot of new things, learn from the students. And as I could develop new content and material, Stanford would allow me to teach more classes. And eventually it became my full-time profession. And I'm very grateful. I mean, Stanford's a place that allows you to try different things and learn different things. We can always start new courses, and it's a great opportunity to continue to stretch our minds in an increasingly rapidly changing world.
Does it help having been a student there to come back as a teacher, or is that like a hindrance, or how does it, is it weird or is it fun?
Well, I think it helps more because there's a lot of the emotions they're going through that I went through when I was their age. So on the one level, I can relate. I mean, it was a long time ago that I was there, but what a young leader is going through in their mid to late 20s or early 30s. I lived that as well. So hopefully there's some empathy. It also gives me unfair competitive advantage because there's nothing that they do to me that I didn't do the faculty when I was a student. So like I kind of know what's really going on with them. But I think one of the things that is different is, as the generations change, I'm kind of mainstream Gen X, right? I'm an OG Gen X person. The differences between what Gen X was like and then what millennials were like, and then now we have Gen Z at the grad school level, they're all very different. Their lived experience has been different, and what it was like to go to school, how they interacted with technology, how society has changed. So one of the things that I have to do is not only, yeah, okay, you see pattern recognition, but also try to be aware and sensitive to the fact that the men and women who sit in front of us are not the same people who sat there 5 and 7 years ago.
Right, right. How does somebody become, Rob, a good teacher? We used to throw our executives into the classroom at Crotonville to kind of make it part of what it meant to be a leader. And, I could observe like who was good at it. And, sometimes somebody was a great executive, but a lousy teacher. How does somebody become a good teacher? Because I think for the audience, you are really
Mm-hmm.
considered to be one of the very finest professors at the GSB. So how did you get good at it?
Well, I don't know that I am good at it, but what I would say is that I had a mentor who taught me how to teach and how to run a classroom. And it's very different than just giving a talk or a presentation in a conference room or a boardroom, because so much of how we teach is interactive and Socratic. And so you have to learn how to kind of keep a conversation flowing, how to try to get across the messages you're trying to get across, but also to listen to the students, because sometimes they'll take you interesting places that maybe you didn't think about. So I think there has to become like a flexibility and an awareness. I think the other advantage I have as an instructor is like I know the material, right? This is we wrote the cases, we did all the readings, and so like over preparation helps me. And so, like when I walk into the classroom, I like to think that I know the material better than the students, but that allows me to try to push and come at things from different angles to try to challenge their thinking. The last thing I'll say that for me is I think that while you're the instructor in front of the room and at some level you're kind of the voice of authority in running the classroom, there's also sometimes a humbleness that can come from that can make you effective. Sometimes the students will say things that we hadn't thought of that can be very insightful, and making sure that you can kind of be aware of that and acknowledge that, and maybe sometimes like let a conversation go on a little bit that wasn't planned. Sometimes that's where the magic happens. Now there are many great ways to teach, and there are many great styles. For me it was the discipline that comes from knowing how to run a classroom, but then also being flexible in the moment sometimes. And
Mhm.
so and sometimes you stay on the lesson plan, and sometimes there's a life lesson that can be kind of woven in.
You're a great provocateur as well. Did your parents teach you how to be a pain in the ass, or did that come naturally?
I think I was born that way, and if I'm a pain in the ass, I think probably got it from my mom. But I think that to me that's fun. The hard part about being a provocateur is you want to push people and challenge people and not let them kind of just say a platitude. On the other hand, you don't want to come across as too aggressive or too mean. And for me, that's something I've always struggled with: is how do you push people to try to make them better, but you don't want to kind of do it with too hard of a hammer. And
Right.
I've been lucky enough to see great leaders, whether it's you or Andy Grove or other, think of all the amazing leaders we've had in the classroom, where sometimes they will push students, but do so in a way where they're trying to kind of seek how to learn and be better as opposed to being right.
Rob, you've had tremendous experience in the classroom that you're now translating to books and kind of trying to teach the broader business community. You've written a book called Brains and Brawn, and you're about ready to launch a book called The Systems Leader. Talk about, what's interested you about the research you've done and kind of where you're trying to progress the whole notion of business thinking in the world today.
I think one of the things that we saw, and you and I were lucky enough to see this together as our courses evolved. The whole idea when we started was about that leadership. If you were combining digital and physical in a world, how you had to lead and the attributes, these dualities that systems leaders need to have of internal and external, hardware and software, which was different than in the past. Incumbent and disruptor, and the best leaders we found were combining both of them. COVID really became about crisis leadership. And you kind of saw, well, wait a minute, how are we going to get our teams through this horrible pandemic that we're wrestling with? But as we've come out the other side, I think the thing that really stuck with me is we are in a world of constant crisis and increasingly rapid technological change. And I worry that the skills that we're trying to give to the next generation of leaders, the way we used to teach leadership may actually not be effective in today's world. And so I spend a lot of time trying to figure out, how do these, in this world of increasing rapid technological change and crisis, how do leaders figure out how to navigate through these things? They're being pulled apart by like a multitude of cross pressures that are literally 180 degrees apart. Things like, how do you think about being good at execution and innovation? And not just at a company level where those things used to be separate, but how do leaders be able to do both at the same time? How can they manage their people thinking both as strength, showing a strong leadership style, but also being empathetic, especially as Gen Z continues to rise up in leadership roles? How do you
Mhm.
think about internal and external? This notion of a CEO who is external and a COO is internal, like that doesn't work anymore in a world where everything's interconnected. How do we find geography, local and global? You and I spent a lot of time talking about this, but where do you put your factories and your jobs and why, and how do you think about geopolitical conflicts and how business leaders navigate through them? And then finally, for me personally, one of the ones that I find most compelling is purpose. How do leaders simultaneously be ambitious and also statesmen and stateswomen of their organizations or stewards of their organization in a world that seems sometimes like we see unserious behavior from a lot of our leaders, and we have to ask ourselves, is this really what leadership is supposed to be, and how do we guide men and women on some very difficult issues? As you've said, how do you lead on nuanced issues in a world without nuance?
Mhm. Rob, when you go out, you're consulting for companies around the world. Like what are the exchanges you're having with the leadership teams, and are they are they grappling with the right problems, or is it difficult to kind of know how to prioritize if you're a CEO today?
Prioritizing, I think, is one of the biggest challenges they face. Having to deliver their numbers, especially if they're a public organization, hitting your quarterly numbers, your annual numbers, and at the same time, rapidly bringing new technologies into what you're delivering to your customers, and then figuring out how do you spend your time and where do you spend your time. And what's I think harder is if in the old days you could stay within a function, finance, engineering, manufacturing, sales, and you could depend on your teammates to do things. Now, because the functions are so intertwined, individuals need to understand a little bit more about what's happening in other parts of the company. And in a world where we're kind of overwhelmed and flooded with data and information, trying to figure out how do you find that time to figure out what you're going to say yes to, what you're going to say no to, what do you do with your calendar? It's hard for leaders. I think leaders are having a hard time. My hope is that with what we're doing and what I talk about in the book on the systems leader is to say to them, here's a framework for how to navigate through this. I'm not going to promise you that it's going to be easy. I'm not going to promise you that if you do this, everything's going to be right. But here are a set of tools that will allow you to guide and lead your teams. And I think people want to be guided and leaded. We
Mm.
see a dearth of leadership and serious behaviors in our politicians and in our business leaders. And I think most people actually want to kind of have the ability to work on a team where they feel like they're doing good and doing well, and a leadership team that's going to provide credibility and stability even
Mhm.
through rapidly changing times.
Rob, you see a couple hundred 30-year-olds every year in the classroom,
Uh,
and they're in theory, they're the best of the best from around the world. What should give us great comfort about the future they're going to create, and what makes us terrified about the future they might create? What's the good news and the bad news?
okay.
What's the good news and the bad news about young folks today?
I'm overwhelmingly positive on the young folks, but hopefully not being naive. So on the positive side, they're young, they're open-minded, they're caring. I think they are way more open-minded in some ways than previous generations and welcoming. And they want to do good and do well. And you do see that. They care deeply about the climate. They care about making sure that there is that society can take care of those that need to be taken care of. They might disagree on the way that that gets done, but most of them are kind, which really that's the part that gives me hope. I think if I had a worry, there's 8 billion people in the world, and there are so many amazing things happening all over the world. And I worry that at a place like Stanford, we can become very insular,
Hmm.
and that we can be out of touch with the lived experiences of people in other countries, in other, even the middle of our country. And that's not good. As leaders, we need to lead people who agree with us and disagree with us, and people with whom we agree and disagree. And I think sometimes the echo chamber can be very real. And so my wish would be that for the younger generation, especially the young men and women that you and I get to teach, that they really don't just pay lip service to understanding others, but they really kind of seek to be a part of the world and parts of the world where they may not have been, and that we don't become too isolated, because I don't think that's a good thing for leadership, and I don't think that's a good thing for society.
Yeah, I think, you wish all of them had to leave Stanford and move to
Yeah.
Toledo or something like that just to see some other part of the world. I agree with that. And I think we're going to pay a price in terms of just the understanding of the world,
Yeah.
globalization. They're just not curious about globalization. And, to a certain
Mhm.
extent, you can understand that because nobody seems to like globalization anymore. So I worry about things like that.
Well, and globalization, the challenges of globalization are real. The displacement of labor and capital, right, which led to a populism all over the world. That's not
All over the
just a
world.
US phenomenon.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we've talked about this in 2017, the first time I went to Saudi Arabia with 30 Stanford students. And this was right before a lot of the changes in their
Right.
society. I realized in that visit, like I learned so much, and I realized that I know nothing. And I
Yep.
think only by being on the ground there and spending time with the men, women, and children there and trying to understand what's going on there could I form my own opinions about, things that I liked or didn't like, or things that I saw and didn't saw. And I'm so grateful that I like to joke that I had children in every country, right? Because we teach students from all over the
Right.
world,
Right.
and having children in every country and getting to see their homes and see what that's like, I think I'm a better teacher because of it. And I would
Yeah.
think that if I were a business leader, when I used to have operating roles, the ability to go into other geographies and other locations will make us better if we really know what's going on and we don't
Yeah.
just stay behind a screen all the time.
Yep. No, I think that's great. Last question, Rob. Again, thanks so much for joining. But when you look out 5 or 10 years, what's like one thing that kind of interests you the most about business or the world or teaching or anything? What's kind of on your mind that you think we'll be talking about 10 years from now?
I think 20th century geopolitical conflict was shaped by political ideology. Originally it was fascism versus Western democracy and communism versus Western democracy, and that shaped a lot of what happened in the 1900s. I think in the 20th century, I think economic ideology is shaping a lot of what's happening in the world. China, U.S., Europe, South America, Africa, etc. And I think that leaders are going to really need to understand deeply what's happening in different parts of the world. I mean, look at this right now, what you see behind me with all the Stanford stuff. This was my home office before the pandemic, and there were pictures of my grandparents and our children and Debbie, my wife, and now it's got the Stanford stuff. And even though I can do this, and you and I can have this conversation through the digital experience, there's something about the physical experience that's real. And what I wonder is how will the next generation of leaders, really know and learn how to navigate and go smoothly back and forth between the real world experience physically and also being able to do this? And
Hmm.
how do we give leader those tools so that they know not only how to navigate and guide and lead their teams, how to adjust where needed, but also how do they make sure they find their moral compasses and their values that they know exactly how they're going to navigate through. And I think that that level of complexity, I think that's going to be really, really hard for men and women and business leaders in the next 10 years. And I think it's going to business leaders are going to play an increasingly important role in society.
Hmm.
As society has changed, people will be looking to their companies and the leaders in those companies, not just to speak up on issues, but also to be modeling good behaviors and guiding teams through tough times. And I think that that's how do we kind of develop the leaders who are good at execution, good at finance and marketing and engineering and manufacturing, but also can understand the more subtle issues that are going to be critical for success on a go forward basis. And I
Yeah.
and I think that that's that interdisciplinary way of thinking. I think is going to be increasingly important over the next 10
I
years.
think, Rob, so it's great, really interesting answer. I think about something in real time where the masters of tech, maybe the smartest people in the country today, know nothing about electricity, right? So they're
Right,
running out of electricity, and they sit there and say, "Well, we'll just build a lot of nuclear power plants." You say,
right.
like, dude,
Well,
that's going to take 25 years. Okay, so you better have a different solution, and they just can't
right.
get their mind wrapped around, how the rules of tech and the
Mhm.
rules of electricity can be completely different. And so to your point, leaders that are able to kind of pick up from one industry to the next and understand what works and what doesn't, that's a trait that really needs to be taught.
And building on that, Jeff, you've got the point that you're getting at, which is what's involved in making, firing up whether it's a gas plant or a coal plant, like to make it work. What does it take to get it built it and permitted and connected to the grid so that you can actually have the electrons? Then there's also the issue of, 2.9 billion Chinese and Indian people get a vote in the energy transition, right?
Sure.
And they're going to need and want inexpensive energy to raise the standard of living for their people. And how is that? We talk about climate and everything else, and like we have a shortage of energy, like much less on the energy transition. So the question is, how are leaders going to be cognizant of
That's
that
true.
too? How are they going to hold these two truths in their head of, okay, we want to make sure we're doing the right thing for the climate, but we got 8 billion people on the planet who need energy, and how are we going to make that happen? Those are, I think, the types of issues that I hope we can develop leaders to be able to hold both of those truths in their minds.
I think and your book should do that. Just one last thought along those lines, Rob. I was reading a report this morning where the direct cost, the incremental cost of making a battery in China versus the US is basically half the cost in China than the US.
Hmm.
Sit there and say, with that kind of dynamic, how can the US ever lead in electric vehicles, right? How can
Right.
that ever happen? But anyhow, I've taxed your time. You got to go write books and teach people and do all this important stuff. But I hope everybody gets a chance to see this. They're gonna you're when just give a plug for your book before we leave. When's it coming out?
Book,
And what's the name?
book will be out on June 3rd, 2025, published by Crown Currency. It'll be called The Systems Leader, Mastering the Cross Pressures That Challenge Today's Leaders. It's based upon the work that you and I have done together over the last 7 years. I interviewed, some of the like 12 to 15 of our deepest, most thoughtful leaders who've come to our class. And there were so many of them, but I got to spend time in depth with a bunch of them. And I'm hopeful that readers will find a few things in the book that will help them, whether they're the manager or director or vice president or even C-level in their company, figure out how they're going to be able to develop their leadership skills over the next couple of decades.
So, Rob Siegel, just for those people watching, this is a guy that's really dedicated his life to teaching the next generations of young students. He's touched thousands of students that have gone through Stanford and has given so much of himself. So, Rob, it's great to be with you, and I look forward to being back in the classroom with you.
Can't wait to see you again, Jeff. All the best.
Great, thanks.